All right, guys, this was Unit 2, Forestry and Resource Management, and it's Chapter 11 out of your textbook. So we're just going to run through really briefly here, overview of some of the major topics and things we talked about. We started the unit talking about just this basic idea of resource management. It was basically a review of some of the things we talked about in Unit 1. This is some of the basic things like renewable resources, non-renewable resources, and one of the major activities we did was fishing and overfishing, and how do we define what overfishing is, and how do we properly manage resource such as fish. And if we're fishing too quickly, then the fish start to die off, they don't repopulate fast enough, and eventually we can end up causing a species of fish to go extinct or no longer be available, and that's a resource we use. Resources like Atlantic cod, here's just an example on this slide, which have great economic importance as well to us, providing food. We then kind of switched gears. We, as far as resource management goes, we stayed the same, but we talked about some different types of resource management as that related to the forest. And we just went over this, but resources are either renewable or non-renewable, and so trees are renewable resources. Is a renewable resource. So many of the resources we find in the forest are renewable. They can be replenished, and it can be done in a lifetime. Things that are non-renewable, we use them once, and they're not coming back again. One of the goals for in environmental science is to have this idea of long-term stability and sustainability, and so we're using things in a sustainable way, meaning we can renew that resource. And one of the three, and we're going to talk about the three different management styles we talked about, was maximum sustainable resource. And so this is the model in which you harvest the maximum amount of a resource that you can, for example, a tree, without depleting future harvest. So you can take 10 trees this year, 10 trees the next year, 10 trees the year after that. If we take 11 trees now, the next year we can only take 9, and that causes problems. Ecosystem-based management was the next one we talked about. The focus of ecosystem-based management was all about keeping the ecosystem healthy. So what are we doing to keep the ecosystem healthy? We're going to prioritize that before taking resources. We're still going to harvest resources, but we're going to do it in a way that minimizes the effect on the ecosystem. The last of the three resource managements we talked about was adaptive forest management, which was more of a scientific approach where we gather data about different types of resource harvesting, and we say, okay, well, this one works the best for this area, and this is why, and we adapt to that model. This is a more time-consuming type of practice because the research of figuring out which model of harvesting works the best takes time. So we then moved on to focusing a little more on the different types of harvesting that goes on specifically in the forest, and talking about the forest in general. And we talked about how the forest has an economic value, such as timber, fuel sources, food sources, raw materials, but it also has an ecological value. It provides biodiversity, it provides a habitat, it provides oxygen, it stores carbon, it purifies water. So there are all these different ecological values to our globe and our environment that we like. There's also the economic value of the resources that we want to harvest out of the forest. One of the major ones is timber. And so we looked at this and we said there's different types of timber that can be, this image here is not on the page all the way. There we go. There's these different types of timber that could be different methods of harvesting timber. One is clear cutting. That's just when you cut down all the trees. And that's a really poor way of doing it because then everything grows back in an even age. This is how a lot of tree plantations work, which is fine, but it's not necessarily the best thing for the environment. There's other ways, such as a seed tree or shelterwood approach, where we leave some of the big trees behind to shelter the basically the clear cutting we did around them. And then there's a selection system where we pick kind of random trees, and so we leave behind more of a complete ecosystem when we're done. And we're just going to flip through those really fast here. So like we said, clear cutting. Clear cutting involves cutting down all the trees in a region, so they're gone. So that whole hillside used to be trees, it's all gone. It's a very cost-efficient way of doing things, but it has a pretty big environmental effect. The seed tree approach, like we said, we're leaving behind a small number of trees to kind of shelter the smaller trees as they grow up. This is also called a shelterwood approach. The benefit is it is less damaging than clear cutting, but it still has a pretty high cost to the environment. Selection system is where relatively few trees are actually cut down at one time. And the benefits is it leaves a more biodiverse environment. So we're leaving behind different trees of different ages, and those are going to leave behind different organisms that help keep the environment going. So deforestation was another topic we talked about when we were talking about the forest resources. And deforestation is a problem more in less developed countries than developed countries. Not that we haven't had problems with deforestation here in the United States, which we'll actually talk about in a moment, but deforestation is when we're taking the forest, we're removing it, and we're turning that land into something else. So the picture here, you see the forest butt up against a farm that used to be forest land. They removed the forest there, and now they're using it for a farm. Deforestation causes problems for the surrounding environment, especially on the edge of the forest. As communities start building further and further into forests, a lot of those animals and diseases those animals carry come into human society. So in the United States, deforestation was a problem, and by the early 1900s, there was very little old-growth forest, especially on the East Coast. Old growth being trees that have been around for quite a long time. And this deforestation in the United States actually led to the creation of the National Forest System, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is just, we already talked about this, but this idea that if you're deforesting and it's going to have an effect on the local community as well. But we finished the unit kind of talking about the forest management system in the United States, which is the National Forest Service and the National Forest System. They're responsible for managing the national forests and timber harvesting and watershed and resource management. So basically they do resource management. And the U.S. National Forest System was created in 1905, originally set aside to grow trees for timber and to protect water. Now the U.S. National Forest System has a multiple use policy, so it's not just timber and water, but recreation, wildlife habitat, mining, and so on. The National Forest Management Act of 1976 was one of the things we talked about, and it required this idea that renewable resources such as timber be managed in the national forest, and that plans are required to be consistent with these principles of multiple use. So the forest is not just for timber, it's not just for water, it's for the animals, it's for recreation, it's for all these different uses. Since 1976, we've actually seen a decline in logging in national forests. A lot of it's done on private land. Okay, the majority of logging in the United States is done on private land, and there are tree plantations. Is typically where you see this in tree plantations. You have the same tree, all of the same trees growing rows after rows after rows, and they come in, they cut them down, and they harvest them, and they go back and replant them, and they do it again. So it's more of a agricultural crop than actually a forest. Um, Fire is a big one in the United States and in national forests. We talked very briefly about this idea of if you just leave the forest for 100 years, there's all this fuel stored in the forest that when a fire comes through, it's going to be a bigger disaster. So how do you suppress fires and remove some of this fuel for fires so we don't have really large, dangerous fires going throughout the forests? Okay. And so that was one of the big pushes for the Healthy Forest Act, Restoration Act in 2003, which encourages this idea of salvage logging, prescribed burns, this idea that we can go through and burn a forest every 5 years or remove logs to keep that habitat healthy and to prevent a really big disastrous fire. The last thing, we didn't really talk too much about this, but there is this idea of sustainable forestry products, or the Forest Stewardship Council. We very, very briefly touched on this, but it's just this idea that companies are using sustainable methods of harvesting timber rather than just destroying environments. Okay, and that was about it.